So today's session is indeed the fourth in GRI's macroeconomic policy webinar series, running through the winter and spring of 2021. The COVID-19 pandemic has led to historic fiscal and monetary stimulus, resulting in unprecedented surges in central bank balance sheets, government deficits, and debt levels not seen since the Second World War. With our webinar series, GRI aims to help our members better understand these extraordinary policies and assess their implications for risk management, financial markets, and the economy at large. I'm very pleased to introduce our two distinguished guest speakers for today, Don Drummond and Jack Mintz, who will provide us with an overview of the current state of the Canadian economy and what can be done to strengthen it, because it is not necessarily very strong right now. Let's start with the introduction. Don Drummond is the Stover Dunning Fellow and Adjunct Professor at the School of Policy Studies at Queen's University. Don is a leading Canadian economist. He is the former chief economist at TD Bank and held many senior roles at the Federal Department of Finance for more than 20 years, where he had the responsibility for economic analysis and forecasting, fiscal policy, and tax policy. Don is recognized for his wide contribution to public policy in Canada and is extensively cited on economic issues. He's a member of the Order of Canada. We also have Jack Mintz joining us today. Jack is the President's Fellow of the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary after serving as the Palmer Chair and founding director. Jack consulted widely with the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, federal and provincial governments in Canada, and various business and nonprofit organizations in Canada and abroad. He is also a regular, I would say actually very regular contributor to the Financial Post. I actually have trouble keeping up with everything Jack is writing, and he's a member of the editorial board of the International Tax and Public Finance. He's a member of the Order of Canada and received the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Medal for his services to the Canadian tax policy community. Welcome, Don and Jack, and thank you very much for joining us today. It's very much appreciated. So Don is going to kick us off and describe Canada's current economic situation. We will then turn to Jack to hear some of his ideas on how to improve Canada's economy. So with that, Don, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter, and good day to everybody. It's a great pleasure to participate in an event of the Global Risk Institute. Way back in 2009, when I was at the TD Bank, I spent quite a bit of time that year trying to establish it, and was very fortunate with the timing and got some reasonably sized bags of money from the Ontario government, the federal government, and the finance institutions. So fast forward over a decade, it's really nice to see it's alive and well and thriving. And Lord knows, as Jack and I will probably convince you, I hope, there's lots of risks for it to be involved with. So I get to lay out the problems. There's a reason why a lot of actors like to specialize in being the bad guys. It's a lot more fun just to lay out the problems, and it's actually easier. The problems are fairly easy to see. Solving them is a little bit more difficult, so I'm leaving that tougher task over to Jack. But I'm first going to depress you with all the problems. There's two things I want to lay by as background and really influence my thinking about the risks. And the first is the nature of shocks that hit the Canadian economy and Canadian people. I think we developed a mindset, in good part for those of us maybe a little bit older. Nothing that bad happened to the economy for a very long period after the Second World War, from 1946 until the really deep recession of the early 1980s. That being said, we built up one heck of a fiscal problem over that period. We built up one heck of an inflation problem, but we didn't really have a very severe economic cycle. But since then, hit with a regular series of them. And yet, each time it happens, we react in surprise that something's happened. And we quite often scramble to deal with them from a position of imbalance going in. And of course, the imbalances just get better, get worse as the time goes on. But if you look back at the history that we've had for the last several decades, something really bad seems to hit the Canadian economy, the Canadian financial sector, and the financial fiscal, at least every decade and sometimes more often. So we know we get garden variety, albeit deep recessions. We had one in the early 80s. We had another one in the early 1990s. We, of course, had a full-blown fiscal crisis in the 1990s, not just at the federal level, but virtually every jurisdiction. It was really interesting to go back in economic history. And if you look at articles written in 2006 and 2007, you'll see that a large body of economists and the international organizations drank the Kool-Aid and thought that if you control inflation and hence you have modest interest rates, you'll never have a severe economic shock. And the thinking was basically monetary policy and fiscal policy can basically be more or less on automatic pilot. And if you do have a cycle, it'll be very minor. You can just tweak interest rates and off you go. And no sooner did that thought start to permeate the profession that we got the biggest downturn we've ever seen coming from the financial sector. Out of the context, with inflation wasn't a problem, interest rates weren't very high, but it just shows imbalances can build nonetheless. And of course, in 2020, we added another source of the shocks, a health one. And I don't think as we enter the second year of this, any of us really believe that this is going to be a one-shot wonder. If and ever we get, certainly we're very vulnerable. So I think we need to change our mindset. We can't always be living on the edge in a position of imbalance and unsustainability and hope that shocks don't happen. They're going to happen. We've seen some really devastating natural shocks already, the forest fires and the like, and flooding. And I think we all probably agree, but we don't build it into our planning necessarily, that those are probably going to come pretty regularly, probably more frequently, and they're going to be more costly. I say this all way of background because most of the conversation right now on monetary policies get back to neutral. Most of the conversation in fiscal is get back to stability, which most people tend to view as getting back somewhere we were pre-pandemic. But we have to ask ourselves, is that good enough? Don't we need to have some kind of buffer to deal with the inevitable next shock, which almost certainly, whether it comes from the economy, the financial sector, the health sector, or some natural disaster, will almost certainly hit us within the next decade? How do we get prepared for that? And I would argue that even in our ambitions, we don't tend to factor that in. The second thing I want to lay by way of background is I think we're in the midst of a shift down to a fairly permanent lower rate of economic growth. And I don't think it's being fully recognized. The most amazing thing to me in the Ontario budget that came out a couple of weeks ago is they had 3 economic scenarios, and their unfavorable economic assumptions was 1.8% real growth on average from 2019 to 2029. That's actually above my base case line in Ontario. My base case line is 1.4% over that 10-year period, and their most unfavorable scenario that they envisioned was 1.8. And my 1.4 does not even factor in the effect of the pandemic and lowering the supply capacity of the economy. So there's another example where there's just a hope and a prayer that economic growth will be strong, and yet there's really no realistic basis to expect that. And in that case, the current situation to me is very reminiscent of the 1973 to 1978 period. Somewhere over that period, Canada shifted down. It turned out to be pretty permanent. It's been going on 50 years now, to a fairly substantial slowdown in our rate of growth, largely from a slower rate of productivity. And it was not recognized, and it took really decades before it was recognized and fully factored in. And if you look back at budgets of that period, you'll see the spending patterns kept going on and the deficit projections just kept getting missed. And it was always, this is just some kind of temporary growth is going to bounce back, and it didn't bounce them back. And I feel we're doing the same thing, although there's even less of an excuse for it this time around. It's a little bit harder to see the slowdown on productivity, and I would say even 50 years completely understand what happened in that period, 73 to 78, and why the productivity growth slowed down so much and didn't recover. But the slowdown we're experiencing right now is largely coming through the demographic side, and that is very easy to predict, and we can see that. And I often wonder when I see the projections that governments are using for their longer run economic growth, that not only their economic models are not working, but their calculators aren't working, and they can't add numbers in their head. I mean, we've got about 1% population growth. We know the labor force is growing much more slowly than that. We're on a long-term trend decline in hours, and productivity growth has averaged 1% per output per hour work since 2000. It's been very steady, and that does not add up to the 2 to 2.25% growth that you see in a lot of the economic forecasts. And I think this could, as it was in the 1970s and 1980s, be a source of policy errors, because we may be trying to stimulate the economy, in particular aggregate demand, to get back to some supply capacity that's overestimated. And we have to overlay that this pandemic economic effect is not just hitting the aggregate demand. In fact, aggregate demand in many respects has held up quite well, and largely to the massive government payments. Household income has actually gone up. The hit has been very largely to the supply side of the economy. Business investment has collapsed for obvious reasons. Immigration has also obviously collapsed as well. We've had a great increase in the mismatching between labor demand and labor supply. And so it was interesting when the economic fiscal statement of the federal government appeared in early December. They said they were lowering their medium-term rate of growth for potential output from 1.8 to 1.4%. The Bank of Canada, in its August 2020 economic outlook, said that they'd knocked off the level of supply capacity for 2023 for the Canadian economy by 3% relative to the estimate they had just done 7 months before. So I think we need to some degree, accept the reality that unless we can pull off some really effective supply side boosting policy changes, the best we're going to do is a fairly modest rate of growth. And if we try really hard to buck that and goose up aggregate demand, we're going to run into problems. So those are my two general backstops. One is we really have to change our mindsets about economic shocks and fiscal shocks. They come more regularly. We have to be much more prepared, and it means we have to have buffers in order to be in a place to handle the next one. And we have to be realistic. Unless we're more successful in boosting the supply side of the economy, we're not going to achieve very strong growth over the next 10 years. Against that backdrop, I'm very worried about the state we're in right now, particularly through the policy levers. In my opinion, monetary policy is meant to operate. You get in and you get out quickly. You got an inflation problem, you hit it hard, and you let the adjustment take place fairly quickly, and you go back to neutral. If the economy is weak, you hit interest rates very hard in the downward direction, and you let it adjust. We're in an unprecedented position where we have been far from a neutral monetary stance now for 13 years, all the way back to 2008. And while this is undoubtedly bolstering the economy, certainly from the aggregate demand side, it is creating an awful lot of imbalances. Sort of the latest one obviously showing up in the housing markets, where unprecedented high housing prices in most of the markets in Canada, not just in certain of the markets. And we're seeing the same thing, of course, on the fiscal side. Not even all governments were in a reasonably fiscal stable position before the pandemic hit, but they're all in bad shape right now. The federal and most of the provincial governments are running about 50% debt GDP ratios. And more concerning from that is they're not really showing any interest in getting back to the lower levels. And they seem to be hell-bent on repeating a pattern we've seen in many jurisdictions. And Ontario is a classic example of that. Every time there's a shock, the debt GDP ratio jumps up. And then as the economy recovers, it doesn't go back down again. It just stays at a higher level. So it's sort of like the stair climber, but you don't ever end the exercise and go back to the original position. You end the exercise at the top of the stair climber, and you have to, you're faced staying there or jumping off a cliff. And that's literally what we seem to be doing in our fiscal plans. You notice in Ontario's case, they have redefined their longer-term fiscal objectives, and they said, whatever the maximum debt to GDP ratio hits over this cycle and dealing with the pandemic, will ensure it doesn't go any higher than that. Well, that's well over 50%. And that is going to cause really big problems, never mind being able to absorb any shock beyond that. We have the federal government coming up in a little while, and they put on the table in the fiscal statement in December, they put a buffer of $70 to $100 billion for fiscal stimulus. And I'm certainly hoping that they don't apply that in the traditional garden variety in terms of stimulating aggregate demand, because aggregate demand seems to be doing okay. And I think when health conditions allow it, people will go back to shopping and the like. We won't see that kind of problem, and we'll end up just pressing against that limited supply capacity. So we need very different approaches on that. And with that word approaches and different approaches, I will end my laying out the problem. And Jack can solve all the things that I've identified. The easy work has been done.
Don, for those insightful, thank you, Don, for those insightful remarks and for pointing out our pretty significant economic challenges, of which there are many. I'm certainly a little bit depressed, but I'm sure that that Jack can fix all that. And I see that there's already your remarks already triggering some interesting questions. But before we answer those, I'm turning it over to you, Jack, to tell us how we can fix some of these economic challenges. Jack, over to you.
Well, Don and I have known each other for many years. In fact, we go back to the first time I worked at the Department of Finance, 1984 to 86, and Don was in fiscal policy and I was in tax policy, and that's exactly what happened. Don was great at pointing out all the problems, but then the tax policy people in their own world had to kind of fix them up. So again, Don's kind of doing the same thing to me again. We then worked together when I was Clifford Clark visiting economist at finance and doing tax reform. Don was head of tax policy, and he and I had offices right across from each other and talked a tremendous amount of time. And so if we kind of sound like each other when it comes to our analysis, I think it's maybe because we've learned so much from each other, we actually come with the same point of view. So I'm not going to repeat, obviously, what Don said. There's a lot of things that he said that I do agree with him. In fact, the only thing I might disagree is I'm not sure we're on a stair climber. In fact, I don't think we are on a stair climber, but we just it's not a matter of ever getting to the top. In fact, we keep falling behind in trying to climb up. But actually, I kind of think of Canadian fiscal and economic policy sometimes like a big tanker in the middle of a canal that gets stuck, and it's very hard to move it. And I think right now we're in a position right now that we've had a huge amount of change. But we're kind of stuck on some old ideas. And in fact, that's the biggest concern I have. And I totally agree with Don that we need to rethink the paradigm. So let me first start with two basic principles. I won't spend a lot of time on them. But I totally agree with Don that this is a supply shock. When it started with the health pandemic, people were told not to go into work. And to stay home and not to consume, and as a result, ended up not consuming certain products. Aggregate demand did not fall. In fact, because of the government transfers and the amount of debt governments took on, that ended up supporting household consumption. Household consumption, if you think of the permanent consumption hypothesis, did exactly what you would expect. People would put money into kind of one-time consumption expenditures like autos and housing and renovations during the pandemic. They would, of course, spend on digital things because that's what they needed to do. But in the end, consumption didn't necessarily go up that much relative to the temporary assistance that they got as government transfers. And so, people talk about this huge increase in consumption down the road. We'll see what happens, but we have to remember that a lot of people would use this one-time temporary expenditures on things like debt reduction and one-time expenditures rather than trying to undertake long-term consumption expenditure. But we will return to something, but we've had a damage to the potential capacity of the country. And the second point, of course, is which Don highlighted is, and I totally agree, is the increasing debt risk. And in fact, I think I think there's a serious problem now in our overemphasis on net debt, where we talk about government debt and then subtract off assets, which I always find kind of ironic that when it comes to the Canada Pension Plan and QPP, we include net assets, which are assets net of 1-year liabilities. But the future unfunded liabilities associated with CPP and QPP are not included in that calculation. So I think we underestimate really the debt problem that we have in this country once you start including that correction alone. But never mind also other unfunded debt, associated with our aging problems, such as old age security. And we have to remember there's a lot of tax provisions that are related to aging. And then, of course, there's going to be healthcare expenditures and other things. And so when I even just take the IMF numbers and I calculate what potential net debt there is in Canada, it's really more of over 100% rather than official numbers, which are much lower. And that's because one could include a lot of these unfunded debt liabilities. And a huge part of the issues are at the provincial level, which I'll come back to in a moment in terms of talking about solutions. Now, let me talk about how are we going to get out of this pandemic. And I'm of the view that growth is really the number one issue. And I totally agree with Don. We're not only have gone into, prior to the pandemic, into a lower growth period, and with population growth around 1% or labor force population growth around 1%, maybe a bit less. But our productivity, actually, labor productivity in the past, since 2015, after the commodity boom bust, has been only a half percent. And so we've been more in the 1.5% range, which I think Don has talked about a lot himself. But I would agree with him that we've even gone into a bigger secular decline since that commodity bust, and so that has actually had an impact. And our investment climate has been very poor as well. If you look at and these are numbers that I put out recently, but we looked at OECD countries and their fixed capital formation from 2015 on. Prior to the pandemic, so to the end of 2019, Canada and three other countries had actually negative growth in capital formation, and that's Australia, by the way, was another one, as well as Mexico, and Brazil was the worst actually. But everybody else had growing investment. Of course, Ireland just went through the roof during that period. So the investment climate is weak. Now, we might blame it all on oil and gas and the resource sector, but actually the numbers that we've looked at, actually the trends were really quite significant in other sectors too. The lack of adoption of new capital technologies and things like that is a serious problem, I think, in terms of productivity. What worries me is that over the next decade, we're going to have even more pressures that are going to make it harder to achieve productivity. Part of it is the aging of the population and the potential skills mismatch or lack of people that are trained for the new industries of the future. And that's because of the way our education system operates, which has a lot of rigidities, kind of like that tanker in the middle of a canal, and the need that we're going to have to, that we're going to need to look at that a lot more carefully in terms of human capital training. The other thing, of course, is the huge energy transition that is taking place, and that's not going to stop, and that will continue. But we have to remember this energy transition is not a matter of creating more GDP. It's actually going to lower GDP because we are trying to avoid a problem in the future. And as a result, that's going to be a slowdown also, or at least make it harder to achieve productivity growth as we try to change the way that we do things in a very dramatic way. It's very expensive, and it doesn't mean that you're going to get additional productivity. In fact, we're moving away from fossil fuel production, particularly oil and gas and coal, which when you look at value added per working hour, those are the highest value added per working hour is oil and gas extraction and mining. Mining will be very much in demand, but the shift away from oil and gas means that we're going to go to other sectors, which with lower value added per working hour. So that means that's going to reduce our GDP, or not increase it. And again, that's for a reason we're doing it, but we have to be realistic about the implications of this very expensive transition that's going to continue over this coming decade. So I'm very concerned actually about that, and I think we need to our policies need to be very much focused on private sector investment, and it needs to be focused on human capital training and improvements to that. And I won't go into all the details about what one can do, but I think that's very, very significant. The other possibility, of course, is the reassertion of inflation, which I know everyone thinks that probably we'll be able to avoid, particularly if it rears its head, that, Bank of Canada will come in and with monetary policy that will be more restrictive, which of course means higher interest rates. But as some people have looked at in terms of the aging and the changes in society around the world, we may be shifting from this oversupply of savings relative to investment to one where investment will increase, partly because of the changes occurring in energy and other things. But while we end up having a reduction in savings as the population ages. And of course, that will mean higher interest rates, real interest rates. And if we do get a resurgence of inflation because of slack monetary policy, then we're going to be again back into a world that we haven't seen in many years, but we know that inflation can have very dramatic impacts on an economy. And of course, tax systems are not indexed for inflation. And that could be a pretty harmful thing that could have in terms of what it means to private sector investment over time. Now, of course, the third solution is going to be fiscal policy as we try to deal particularly with the debt problem. And we do get this resurgence of demand-driven growth, which could be inflationary if we're not careful, but we do need to build up this potential capacity in the economy. And taxation, of course, really isn't just a matter of raising revenue for governments, which is important, but it's also can have very dramatic impact on productivity in terms of what sort of things are taxed. And so if we end up in a world where people feel that we should continually raise taxes on at the upper end, wealth taxes and financial transaction taxes and higher marginal personal taxes, and go through the gambit of that, then that's going to have an impact on incentives, and will have an impact. But of course, there are some people that believe these incentives or taxes don't have an impact on behavior. But for those of us who've spent years looking at those issues, we would dramatically disagree with that point of view. Now, of course, there are taxes that have less harm on the economy, and that's been shown in terms of impact on growth across countries. And obviously, consumption taxes are better. But there is a very interesting question that we should be asking ourselves, and that is, who should be raising consumption taxes? Should it be at the federal level, or should it be at the provincial level? The provinces are in a very serious debt problem, and they have the greatest demands in terms of healthcare and education. And so they're the ones that really face huge difficulties. And in fact, my feeling is that actually the provinces should be raising their HST rates, not the federal government raising the GST rate, which is actually a little different than what everyone says. And the reason for that is because I think consumption taxes for a province are particularly less harmful than other types of taxes, because it doesn't have as much impact both on mobile factors of production that leave the province, because provinces face a lot more mobility than the federal government. At the national level, people don't move across countries very much, although in a digital world now we might see that jobs easily shift around the world on a labor front. But within a country, labor is much more mobile, and consumption tax, income taxes can have a much more or bigger impact of mobility of labor in a federal state than within the federal state than across international boundaries. And so I think the provinces particularly need to rely on property taxes, maybe healthcare premiums, and I think on HST revenues more so than what the federal government should be doing. And I think that's a whole issue around tax assignment in the country that I think will need to get addressed, I think, this coming decade as well. But we should be very careful about who ends up, or which level of government is going to end up raising whatever taxes. Now, I'm of the view that we're going to need spending control, and be very targeted in our spending it on the things that we need. And I would argue that spending control is more important, partly because I've been very influenced by Elisina's work, who unfortunately passed away last year, But Alberto Alsina, who's done a lot of work on this, has shown that when you increase taxes to deal with deficit problems and debt problems, you actually slow down on a longer term period growth compared to cutting or constraining spending. And I think we're going to be in this decade a period of spending constraint because in the end, raising taxes is going to be difficult on the broad population. Sure, you can hit the rich with some more taxes, but frankly, that well can only go so deep, since already we know under the personal income tax, the top 10% of the population pays 60% of personal income taxes. And so there's a question about how far you can keep hitting the same people without creating significant problems in itself. In other words, you're going to need a broad increase in taxes, and that's why a number of people argue for increasing the GST at the federal level, because it is a broad tax, and it would hit a lot of people, including the elderly, which is why it's very unpopular. We also have to remember that if we're increasing carbon taxes, that's going to also have a negative impact on lower income people, and so that's why there's in the U.S., for example, there's actually a lot of resistance even amongst the Democrats for having carbon taxation, because they feel that this is bad for low income people, and they want to look at things that are going to hit higher income people more. So the spending side, I think, is going to need to be dealt with. But one of the areas that we will see a lot of spending on, I think, and I'll go back to this, is the energy transition. And this is where I think public policy has got to be much more careful in what we're doing, accepting that we need to get to net zero emissions by 2050 as a target around the world. I think the question is, what is Canada's best way of doing that? And I think the principle should be that we should have policies that achieve the target at the least cost possible, least economic cost possible. And we've done very little of that kind of analysis in understanding what is the best pathway to get to that target amongst different alternatives. There are some countries that have done that, like New Zealand, but in the end, I think we need to understand that a lot better. And my feeling right now is we kind of have carbon policy on steroids in this country, where we're doing everything. We're raising carbon taxes to $170 per ton by 2030. We're bringing in all sorts of new regulations. We're bringing in subsidies. We're bringing in, for retrofits and for electric vehicles, et cetera. And as an example, bringing in the clean fuel regulation on top of the carbon tax, in my view, makes very little sense, since the two have, one's actually narrower than the other. The clean fuel regulation applying mainly to gasoline and diesel, while at the same time creates a whole construct of credits and all sorts of compliance and administrative costs, when we already are going to have a carbon tax which is more general and applies to more different sources of energy. So why are we doing both? It just makes absolutely no sense to me. So we need to have a much bigger conversation, because that energy transition will have an impact on GDP. And I think the less that we can have its impact on GDP, the better, I think, for Canada and trying to come back. So I think, Peter, I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Jack. Those are some very interesting ideas, and hopefully, let's wait and see what's in the budget. Hopefully, we'll see some of that. I think we are now going to move on to our question and answer session. So earlier this year, as part of our macroeconomic series, we hosted a session with Stephanie Kelton on MMT, Modern Monetary Theory. Maybe I should ask you, Don. Rumor is that MMT can solve all of Canada's federal debt problems. Is that right, or do you think that MMT has some challenges?
I find the advocates of the modern monetary theory are really fascinating, because I don't think they read to the end of the article. The theory actually does not deny the possibility that what is being advocated would create an inflation problem, but they say if there is an inflation problem, it should be handled by fiscal tax policy, particularly tax increases. And what I find is fascinating is that many of the people who advocate the modern monetary theory are also advocates of lower taxes. And that makes me think that they maybe only read the first half of what the theory was about. I think that also falls into that camp that there's always a tendency to believe that something has changed and something will operate differently and on a permanent basis. And I think, well, maybe that may be true. We probably won't have a really good answer for that 20 years. But again, you're called the Global Risk Institute. How much risk you want to take? Because if you go along that route and we end up, as Jack said, with if you count on a comprehensive basis, we'll be way over 100% debt to GDP ratios. And suppose it is wrong and we do end up with an inflation problem, we end up with an interest rate. It's kind of beyond the point of no return at that point, and you've created a huge cost to be hard to come by. So I think we're better off to assume that everything hasn't completely changed and there's certain patterns we've seen in the past that we should be mindful going forward. And we should strive for both fiscal stability and monetary stability and try to ensure we keep inflation low and not take it for granted that that will come naturally.
Jack, do you want to add to that, or do you think that Don has sort of said it all?
Don's pretty well said it all. I totally agree with what he said. And it is true that the MMT people do have the final page talking about raising taxes and to curtail any inflation. So although they don't talk about, you know, where their bias is, they don't talk about spending cuts to curtail inflation either. But I think one of the other points that often is said, and I heard many commentators make this comment, that the money multiplier has dropped quite a bit. And you know, and maybe this is something we need to understand better. But one really interesting analysis I reviewed recently on the 2008 financial crisis is that you know, the banks had a lot of very bad loans and very bad assets that were on their balance sheets, and so the transactions that took place at that time to support the financial sector actually was trying to offset what could have been a significant monetary contraction. And so what this analysis is saying is that today, what's happened in the United States right now has been a very significant increase in M2, whether one agrees that's the right measure of monetary policy and impact on the economy, but arguing that that U.S. could potentially see a much higher rate of inflation. Certainly when you look, I've kind of looked at the consumer price index and the various components. And I think once we start getting past 2020 and we start looking at annuals that no longer include 2020 months in them, I think you're going to see inflation that's going to be closer to 3%. And then I think people are going to start asking the question, are we starting to hit a higher level, which will get built into expectations, or whether the the central banks around the world are going to have to reply to that. But anyway, I don't have much belief in MMT theory, just like Don. And in fact, to me, it's just really, really, when you go back to the original concepts of monetary policy, to me, it's really no different than that. It's just a misunderstanding of it.
Well, thank you very much. So you both sort of talked a bit about, well, actually quite a bit about our issues on the supply side on the economy. And so my question is, what kind of measures do you think that the federal government should take to boost business investment and productivity? Productivity is another big issue. So maybe I'll start with you, Jack, on that.
Well, I mean, there's 2 points I think to be made here, and that's the question is what's holding back investment so much in the country, and it is serious. I worry about adoption of investment. A lot of people get focused on innovation, which is important too, but I worry particularly about the lack of adoption of new ideas, and that comes with capital investment because you buy the latest vintages of capital goods and things like that. Accelerated depreciation, in my view, is okay, but it was very it was primarily focused on certain sectors, or at least bigger benefits given to certain sectors, which we commonly do in Canada. We still have this mentality of resource and manufacturing as being important and service sectors being unimportant, even though there's been improvements along that over the years. There's still that mentality, I think, in public policy. In fact, Canada actually has one of the biggest differentials in effective tax rates on manufacturing versus service sectors in any OECD country. We tend to have much lower effective tax rates in manufacturing, and that showed up even under the accelerated depreciation. So my preference, actually, if we did corporate tax reform, we do a major rethinking of the corporate tax, or at least try to follow along the lines that we've had since 2000 of trying to achieve more neutrality in the system and letting the market figure out where best to put capital investment, but encourage all sectors to adopt the latest innovations possible. But the other side of investment, of course, is the other side of taxation is the personal tax system, and I do worry about the high effective tax rates on higher income individuals, and frankly, I know we talk about one percenters, but one percenters, if you're living in Toronto and have $220,000 in the city of Toronto and you're a single earner, I could tell you you're not rich. And the problem of having a fairly progressive system that we have right now is that it does actually inhibit the incentives for people to move into skilled lines of work, but also it could have eventual impact on brain drain if we start seeing that happening again. And I am very concerned about that potential because of the fact that Canada's per capita incomes measured in US dollars has now been falling relative to the US, and the pandemic has made that worse, actually. And I think that the potential for brain drain over this coming decade could be a serious issue if we're not careful. And so luckily we have right now a US government that looks like they're going to go after the rich, so maybe that won't be as much of a problem. But we know that the US operates very differently in that way. The other side of investment is regulation, and I think Canada has done very badly in certain areas, and it shows up in a lot of studies done internationally. We have a tough time getting goods to Tidewater compared to, let's say, like Australia and the United States. We have a very slow permitting system, which is partly due to municipal and provincial regulations that make it very difficult to get projects completed. By the way, the US really has problems in that way too, but Australia has solved that much better than we have. And so there's a lot of things that we need to do on the regulatory side, and that's a real win-win because that could actually spur investment while at the same time save the government a little money if we can cut some of the administrative costs associated with those regulations.
Yeah, I was going to say the definition in the US of rich is a little bit different than in Canada. Don, do you want to add something to that?
So
like, how do you think we should stimulate? How do you think we should stimulate business investment to
So a 30-second commercial for me. I am a co-author of the CD House Shadow Budget, which came out at 6 o'clock this morning, so I assume everybody's read it in the early hours this morning. But we have two measures in there, and one is a recommendation for, as timed again, to reduce our corporate income tax rate. The rebalancing we achieved the last time around was largely undone by the 2017 adjustments in the United States, and part of that will be restored if Biden goes ahead with increase in the U.S. corporate tax rate, but still another reduction is in order. And one was a little bit harder for people who don't like to play with temporary measures. We do recommend a temporary, with the emphasis on temporary, investment tax credit of 5%. So two measures in there that would deal with the problem. One on a longer term basis, the corporate income tax reduction, and one to get a short term boost to investment coming out of the pandemic.
And on the investment tax credit side, would that, in your view, should that apply to all investments, or should that be targeted, from, let's say, and I think I know Jack's answer to this, but should that be, considering Build Back Better is a theme here, should that be focused on certain kind of investments?
No, to avoid any kind of distortions and artificial resource allocations or allocations, we suggest applying it across the board.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So maybe, we also talked a bit about, I think Jack actually raised the issue around spending. And so if we like one of our future spending challenges, I think was also mentioned, is healthcare spending. So if you ask, and I know that this is a bit risky to ask this question right now at this point in time, but I'm asking it. If you ask anybody on the street whether we should spend more on healthcare, the answer is always yes, with a big exclamation mark. But should the answer always be yes? So for example, Singapore spends about roughly, I think if my numbers are correct, about half on a per capita basis what Canada spends, and the quality of Singapore's healthcare system consistently outranks Canada's healthcare system. In other words, should we also sort of think a bit about how effective and efficient our spending programs are, and as opposed to just automatically increase spending?
Maybe I can take the lead on that. I guess my first response to that, when you say people think we should spend more, is to define more on what basis we're talking about. The natural spending pressures on healthcare means you have to spend a lot more just to continue to get what we've got, which I arguably from an international perspective is pretty mediocre. We have fairly mediocre health outcomes, and we have a fairly mediocre record on health restoration. And yet, next to the United States, we're in a small echelon of the higher spenders. But if you've not only got from the demographic side the 1% population growth, you've got to cover. You've got 1 percentage point increase in health spending every year because of the aging of the population. Just as an example of that, we have a roughly 300,000 long-term care beds in Canada. And if people continue to go to long care at the same percentage at every age, by 2035, that 300,000 would need to be 600,000. And I hope that doesn't happen. I hope we build alternatives such as better here, but that gives you a sense of that pressure. Inflation in the healthcare sector always runs higher than the general inflation. So if we're running 2% in the economy, it's typically 2.5%. And we have a trend increase in the intensity of healthcare use. We develop mechanisms to replace joints. Obviously, we're going to make those available to people. Next thing we'll know, we'll be able to do brain transplants. In anticipation of that, I put myself on the waiting list already. I hope those are coming in the next little while. But these things are going to be great. They'll improve the quality of life, but they're going to cost more. So basically, we talked about the stair climber. I guess if we switch to the treadmill right at the moment, if you want to stay in the same place in the treadmill, you got to increase healthcare spending about 5 to 6% a year. And that doesn't even buy you much by the way of improvement. That's just kind of the way we do. Now, the counter somebody be is healthcare spending has not gone up in Canada until this year relative to GDP since 2011. But look how governments did that. They starved capital investment from 2011 to 2014 and just bought themselves a bucket load of problems. They just snowplowed everything forward and created capacity problems. Ontario just arbitrarily, unilaterally cut physicians' pay by 3%. That came back to bite them because the arbitrator restored that. Alberta, seemingly ignoring that message, wants to do the same thing in that province, even though they saw that didn't work somewhere else. And we were pretty lucky. We had a benign period on pharmaceuticals. We didn't have very many big, new, expensive brand names come on until 2016, and we had a lot of expensive ones come off the patent protection, but that's now shifted. And with the new pharmaceuticals that are becoming available, loss of that will go up very much. So it won't be driven because people want more and better healthcare. Healthcare is just going to cost a lot more every year just to stay constant. And I'm sorry, once again, I'll pick on the Ontario budget because they basically said in that budget, there's nothing to see here. We're projecting out to 2030, and life is just great. All we need to do is keep program spending increasing at 2%. Hint, hint, that's not very difficult. There's nothing to see here. Turn away. Well, that included healthcare spending growing at 2% a year and education spending growing at only 1% a year. Well, 2% in healthcare spending, that just covers the rate of inflation. That doesn't even cover population growth. Never mind the aging of the population, never mind the additional inflation, never mind any increase in usage. In Ontario, we had a kind of a benign period of education because the school-age population fell for quite a long time. But now we have the grandchildren of the baby boomers, and I've raised my hand here. I got 2 of them coming into schools. They're hitting the schools and the school-age population. It's very difficult to keep spending growing constant and real terms and having it decline year after year in real per capita terms. You can't just say, turn away, there's nothing to see here. That's very difficult. So I do think we're going to have a lot of pressures. And of course, coming back to Jack's point of the provinces being squeezed, the federal government did a pretty reasonable job fiscally of insulating itself from some of these pressures. It said that Canada Health Transfer would only increase GDP, but healthcare spending will almost certainly increase more rapidly than that. At least the pressures will be there to have that more rapid. And the federal government is doing what it did in the 1970s. It's offering limited funds for a limited time period, 5 years for home care funding. Now it's offering 2 years for long-term, bait the provinces into trying to join some program and then walk away from it. So big problems there mainly for the provinces.
Jack, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of things that Don said I would agree with, but let me just add a few things. Number one, I do think that we have to always strive for more efficiencies in the system to try to save costs, and there's going to be a lot of pressures with regard to that. But I don't think that's going to solve the problem. I think there's going to be huge demands on healthcare in some areas over the coming years, and that's partly because of new drugs that are going to come on, new treatments, long-term care requirements, and because of the aging population, et cetera. So those healthcare is going to become even a bigger number, I think, as a share of GDP for those reasons. I think the bigger question is how much you split between the private and the public healthcare systems. And in fact, in Canada, we've tended to have a ratio, and Don, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but as I recall, public sector pays about 70% of healthcare expenditures, 30% by the private sector. We know that dental is completely public or private, and except for welfare cases that get public support. But we have one party now that's pushing for a dental care program. We have pharmacy drugs that are primarily paid by individuals through their health plans, private health plans, or their own spending. And some of it's supported, especially for seniors, but for low-income people through provincial drug programs. But here we're talking about a government bringing in a pharmacare program at the national level that's currently in power. And that's going to be more national spending. That's public spending that's going to be required on the public system if that occurs. And I'm not sure how affordable all this is going to be, especially if we want to have more money spent on things like, electric vehicle chargers and all sorts of other things that people are talking about. So the healthcare issue, I think, is very significant. The one piece of good news that could have potentially quite a large impact on reducing healthcare costs is a movement towards virtual medicine, and this could allow for all sorts of things, not only cutting back the number of visitations to doctors, or at least doing it in a much more efficient way, but also even in rural areas, not needing a hospital, but actually being able to carry out procedures that could be done remotely. In fact, I met people in Calgary where doctors were, doing certain things in the Northwest Territories from Calgary, doing it virtually. That's kind of interesting. So we'll see how these new technologies develop in the future. But the one thing that worries me about Canada, because of the way we run our system, is that governments are entirely focused on what I would call the cost effectiveness criteria. So they only look at innovations if it helps reduce costs in the system. They don't look at the benefit side. And this is where we're going to end up far behind other parts of the world, where there's more of a look also at the benefit side of healthcare. And that's where the demands are going to be also by the public. They will want to have things that are going to help them and make them better, even if it costs more. And so maybe at some point we're going to have to give up some of our shibboleths and say, you know what, maybe we're going to have to introduce some user fees in the system. If people had to pay something to visit a doctor, or some of the the basic costs, then we could have more money to afford some of these other things that people would like to see in the system. Otherwise, we're just going to drag along over the next decade trying to save costs all the time through efficiencies, and always seeing these demands increasing. And I agree with Don. I think there's more upside to increases in healthcare expenditures as shared GDP than there were more downsides. And so this is going to be another source of problems because people care most about healthcare, which means that other issues could end up getting less prioritized in terms of government spending, as that's not where the public is going to be.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we've already touched a little bit on the importance of the U.S., right? We're not living just in Canada in isolation, but we got to certainly have a pretty good view as to what the U.S. is doing. And so there's a couple of questions. I'm trying to wrap that into a question around Biden's stimulus bill. So do you like President Biden's $2 trillion stimulus bill, and how do you think it would impact Canada? And maybe, Don, I'll start with you on that.
Well, I certainly think there's some good things and there are some absolutely essential things. We know that we're in a very tough position where some of their programs equivalent to ours, like their employment insurance program, was running out of the additional and extended services. And amazingly enough, for a while, Congress seemed to be quite content to just let people loose on that front. And so they're dealing with that. But, you know, I think they're doing what a lot of politicians do, and they're never let a good crisis to go to waste, and they're adding an awful lot of stuff that is not central to the themes that they're trying to promote, and not even related to it, and is too large, and of course developing this attitude that will pay for it through tax increases. So I think while there's some essential elements, it is too big, and there's a lot of stuff that shouldn't be in there, and we're going to see too much pressure on the tax side to fund it. All while they run an extraordinarily high debt burden.
Yeah, but maybe Jack, I should let you go first, and then we can ask some follow-up questions.
Yeah, I just I think 2 points. I think first of all, I agree with Don. There's some of the infrastructure spending is I think quite reasonable and good to do actually for the economy. And I think that's going to be very positive for the U.S., which of course could have some spillover effects on Canada, subject to the Buy American policies in the United States that might make it difficult for some Canadian suppliers to participate in some of the infrastructure spending. But leaving that aside, I think that part could be quite positive. However, there's a lot of spending there that it's not clear really what the long-term impact is going to be on the U.S. It may be nice to have some of the things that to help, let's say, people deal with, some of their health concerns and things like that. But the productivity increases that you get from large parts of the package, I don't think are there. However, most of the expenditure is, in fact, the Biden plan, I read it, and they say that the corporate tax is not only going to cover the cost of the program, but I guess they have some sort of multiplier in mind, but they're also going to help contribute to the lower deficit. But what they're going to be doing is squeezing out private investment in order to have more public investment. To the degree that there is public investment in the infrastructure plan, and I'm not sure that's actually going to help very much long-term growth in the United States. The other part that I think we have to remember about the infrastructure program is that I think the U.S. now understands that they are in a major rivalry with China, and so some of the expenditures are very much focused on trying to drive more research in the U.S., more industrial capacity in the U.S., such as chip making possibilities. All that I think is all that is not surprising, and I think this is going to be a pressure point faced by the U.S. In the coming years. Is how they are going to deal with really this very strong rivalry coming from China, and that's going to have to force them on a better growth path. And I don't think they're in that mind yet. I think when you actually look at the overall stance, it's all about redistribution and with building some internal capacity and investment strength. But I think they still haven't yet kind of figured out how they're going to get private investment as being a major part of what they're going to achieve. They seem to think that it's mainly going to come along with lots of demand stimulation by the federal government. As for Canada, of course, that can put us in a more competitive position relative to the US, which is positive. And also any growth that does come in the US, I think will be positive for Canada, since we export a very significant share of our GDP to the United States. So those things are good, but I think the longer run picture, especially the corporate tax hikes that are being planned in the United States, if they happen, which they may not, because of the way Congress makes decisions, but if they do happen, then there are that will potentially hurt the U.S. And we get dragged down with it as well.
Yeah. Do you think that some of these measures are actually a threat to sort of our integrated supply chain, especially I'm thinking on the electric vehicle side, the automotive side in general? Do you think that that's going to have? Are we going to be able to get a special status, with the U.S.?
Well, it hasn't been unusual to get Canada getting special status with Mexico, by the way, often in a number of policies. I remember when I used to go through some of the tax system, there was always special exemptions for Mexico and Canada, which I think understands is a North American system to deal with. And maybe this is one good thing about the Biden administration right now is they are very focused on building better relations with their allies, even though they have kept the aluminum and steel tariffs on Canada, which, by the way, we don't seem to say much because it's not Trump doing it, but it's Biden doing it. But anyway, but maybe maybe we could see a shift towards not just a matter of building better capacity in the United States, but building better capacity in North America. So North America as a region could be very competitive relative to Asia and China particularly. And I think it'll be interesting to see if we can get a shift in that thinking in that direction. But right now, I don't see it in Washington. If anything, it's become even more protectionist amongst both parties than ever before.
Yeah, and no, I was going to ask you too, Don. What your thought?
This wasn't on that specific point, but it was just a thought particularly relevant, I think, for the Global Risk Institute, because what has been happening over the last couple of months just shows you how quickly the ground shifts on an economy and public policy. A year ago, I would say a predominant thought in Canada is we better not do very much on the environmental front because we're going to be way offside with what the United States is doing, i.e. nothing and regressing. And here we fast forward only a matter of months, and now we're really concerned we're going to get left behind from the United States. And who knows, in 4 years again, maybe they'll go another direction. But I guess at points, you better decide where you want to be in the longer term yourself and kind of move there, because players come and go and change their position, and you can't get buffeted around all that much.
Actually, I would say, I think just on following up on Don's point, especially on the environmental issue, the problem we see these huge shifts in the U.S. all the time, and in some ways, really, what Canada's best position, in my view, is to harmonize our policies with the United States as much as possible, and it's difficult, though, when you have a country that's shifting so much. And so what does harmonization mean when you're harmonizing now or 4 years from now or 10 years from now? But, Canada is, especially on the whole issue of carbon, we are going actually in a different direction than the U.S. We're going much faster and doing a lot more. But I think it's also going to raise a huge issue, I think, around our carbon tax or carbon pricing levels, because if we are at 170 a ton by 2030 and the U.S. does not have a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, but let's say maybe a few states do, like California, we're going to have to seriously think of a carbon tariff on U.S. manufactured goods coming into Canada. In fact, I've been doing some work on that, and it would be fairly significant, by the way, because really what most people in carbon pricing policies would say is that we should be trying to maintain international competitiveness by exempting exports and taxing imports coming into the country. And most of the emissions that we import from the United States, 75% of it is manufacturing. And so we would be looking at a very significant tariff on manufacturing if we were to if we were to go to $170 where the US is at zero or something close to zero.
Yeah, the question is whether that's practically feasible or whether that has an impact on how we deal with climate change domestically, because of the point that you made earlier around aligning with the U.S. It's like even Biden talks about border adjustments, whereas they don't even have a carbon tax. So it's an interesting discussion. I think that's all in flux. The stimulus bill, maybe just one last question. I think you touched on it a little bit, but we have a stimulus bill, or at least that's the intention, somewhere between 70 and 100 million. Do you think that the U.S. Stimulus bill has any impact on what we should be doing from that perspective? Should we spend less because there will be a lot of spillover effects from the U.S. $2 trillion package? In other words, is there a need? Like, I think some people already questioned whether there was a need because of the fact that demand doesn't seem to be a problem, and the economy will get a boost, and as a result, the stimulus bill will overheat the economy. Sorry, Don, I can't hear you. I see you're talking.
You have to unmute me. There you go. Obviously, we can be a free rider in what happens in the United States, and that's fair enough. But even if the United States doesn't do that, I have argued we should not be using $70 to $100 billion for any form of conventional stimulus, which tends to be to encourage households to spend. I don't think that they need that. The income number stayed up. Believe me, we're just now in a more severe form of Ontario lockdown. But if we could go to the stores tomorrow, I think we'd all head out to the stores tomorrow, and I don't think we're going to have that problem. There are some problems that need to be dealt with. So some form of that 70 to 100 billion, one of them, and it just seems kind of boring, but that's the life when you're doing budget planning. The fall update was very deceitful on the employment insurance account. There's a piece of legislation that says the employment insurance account has to be balanced over 7 years, and they've frozen the contribution rates for this year and next year. We know that the account has been hit very hard during the pandemic and will continue to be hit hard. So implicitly in the fall update, a very, very large employment insurance premium increases for employees and employers beyond next year. And that, of course, would have a devastating impact on the ability to get people back into the labor market from both employees and employers. So in the shadow budget we did with the CD Howe, we actually credit the employment insurance with the hit from the pandemic. But that's $6 billion right there of that amount. Childcare is really fascinating because I have never heard it discussed in the economic content to the extent it has been in the last year, but people have finally dawned upon it. It's just a parent issue. It's a critical aspect of the labor force and the function of the economy when there's so many families where there's two income earners are working, and something needs to be done. So we talked about the farmer care. We've talked about a national training strategy. They've talked about national child care. I don't think any of that stuff will happen. I don't think the mood and the federal relations is that you're going to get an agreement on any of that kind of farmer care. The provincial plans are so different. Some of the provinces like Quebec kind of reasonably cover most people already. They're going to play a game. I don't think they'll play a game on the child care. So we're recommending improved tax treatment for child care on the shadow budget, and we also recommended improved treatment for medical experience because I don't think there'll be a national farmer care. So there are some things that need to be done, and that could use part of that 70 to 100,000. But I really don't like tagging the term fiscal stimulus on. I know that's we're not in the period like we were after the 80s, 90s, or even after the financial crisis in which goosing aggregate demand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I just would add one point, and that is there is one particular additional risk that's this year in 2021, and that is the fact that it is taking time to get out of this pandemic. It's the vaccine rollout is slow. In fact, it's been a huge number of articles written about how slow Europe is relative to the United States, but we're even slower than Europe. If you look at every European country has gone further than us in terms of vaccine rollout right now. So But that means is that these lockdowns are going to continue for a while. We're back into a third wave already this spring. And maybe we'll finally get the population vaccinated by the fall, but we're looking at 2021 as being really weak for a number of sectors in the economy, which of course is going to include retail, accommodation, airlines, et cetera. And support is still going to be needed, but I think it has to be targeted support. But that may be part of the so-called fiscal stimulus for this year is to provide that temporary support. Well, I know that the budget or the fiscal update last November was thinking 70 to 100 billion on a longer term basis, but I think this year there's still going to be need for some more temporary support given to the Canadian economy in a number of sectors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think, Jack, you already, like sort of switching gears a little bit, but you already touched on the fact that you think that having different kind of measures stacked upon each other in order to deal with climate change and hitting our net zero 2050 goal is not a good idea. But what kind of monetary and fiscal tools do you think the federal government should use, if any, to hit the 2050 net zero commitment under the Paris Agreement?
Well, I think, well, first of all, I've always, one of the reasons I've been attracted to carbon taxes or carbon pricing over the years, I'm actually like cap and trade systems myself, is that I do like the idea of putting a price on the externality. That's the appropriate thing to do, and then let markets figure out how to best respond to it. And so that's why I've always felt that was the best approach. And the one with the least economic cost. And that's because we really don't know what sort of technologies are going to win. In fact, it's interesting. Last night I participated in a pretty large panel on Advantage Alberta and talked a lot about innovation and things that's happening. And I had a huge number of people got in touch with me overnight about things that their company is working on in terms of clean energy and things like that. It's amazing, actually, what's going on. And it reminds me of New Zealand actually had a very good study came out in 2017. And what they did is they looked at 3 paths to try to get net zero 2050. And the first one was just simply raising carbon taxes, which they said would have to go to $800 a ton by 2050 in order to get to net zero. And they said, well, that's really a lot. And in fact, it would have a significant impact in GDP. I think it was around 17% total impact by that point. So they said that, we have to do better than that. So they looked at 2 other paths in which a lot of it involved innovations that we don't have yet. In fact, one of them I found very amusing because it was vaccinating sheep in order to reduce their methane emissions. So that was actually one of the major innovations for New Zealand to try to deal with getting to 2050, net zero 2050. But I think the point there is that innovation, I think, is absolutely key. And so along with carbon pricing, I would have incentives for research into reducing carbon and try to encourage that the most. And I suspect when I've looked at every plan of getting to 2050, we see that, there's some disagreements what's going to be needed, but there's a huge number of alternatives, whether it's nuclear, whether it's carbon capture, utilization, and storage that could lead to hydrogen and blue hydrogen and green hydrogen, et cetera, et cetera. There's all sorts of them out there. We don't really know where we're going to land. And so I think what governments need to do is stand back, not try to say what the solution is and try to then bring in a whole bunch of different policies, but instead, I think, do pricing, but then have a very significant research component to develop the technologies to get emission reductions.
And how about scaling, right? So one of our big issues that is sort of an issue across, I think it's not just climate related, but we have a problem where we actually commercialize technology. So we are through the R&D phase, and now we have to scale it. And then at that point in time, most of the technology actually leaves Canada. Are you in favor of actually making sure that we have better fiscal measures in place to help with scaling, like in the form of tax incentives, tax credits? both investment tax credits and production tax credits, for example.
Well, commercialization of research has been a long-going problem. We've had so many reports. I think, Don, you might remember some of them as well, on how to encourage more commercialization of research. And one of the things that there was some attempt was to say, well, let's try to create more incentives for jobs to be in Canada, that would take advantage of the scaling. But, when I look at the carbon issue, I think really what we could do is actually, if we did find the technologies, is to try to then get the value of them through selling those technologies internationally. And it's going to be in the areas that we have comparative advantage. And comparative advantage,
licensing, like keeping them, but licensing.
Exactly. And I think the intellectual property issues are going to be very important, I think, to deal with that. But I think one of the things that, I notice, that I think we need to be much more aggressive on our policies to protect our intellectual property, and to make sure that we help our exporters get into international markets with the technologies that are developed in Canada. And we have to remember, carbon is it's a global. Climate change is a global issue, and the only way we're going to solve it is internationally. No single country's action, except for maybe a few big ones like China, United States, and Europe as a whole, European Union, can have a dramatic impact on emissions. If you're a country like Canada, we're responsible for 1.6% of total worldwide emissions, our actions don't have a big impact on global warming. And so we need to have, I think our role really is to provide those new technologies that anywhere could be used. And so we should try to take advantage of the value associated with that.
That is the huge opportunity. And I think we also have to make it attractive for actually people to own IP in Canada. And right now we're not doing that. So Don, do you want to say something about this particular topic, like scaling of technology?
Well, I don't even think it's specific to the scaling of the technology. A general problem we've always had in Canada, some of us call it the valley of death. We tend to create firms at a pretty good rate in Canada. They tend to grow fairly rapidly at the beginning. And as they tend to get in that 400 to 600,000 revenue annual, they tend to stall there, or they sell out, and they don't tend to blast past that. And if you look in the United States, they don't tend to flatten out in that pace. They tend to go further. It's probably no coincidence that the valley of death seems to occur wherever the small business deduction level is appearing. Although in the really bad old days, it did make some sense tax-wise to actually take the money out of your small corporation, even if you had to pay personal income tax. But that hasn't been the case for a long time. So I'm not quite sure how much the split rate that we have between small business and large business. I don't like that split. I think it's insane. We have elevated small business as a darling of Canada and always claim they create all the jobs, but they also destroy most of the jobs too. And the jobs tend to be more permanent than larger businesses. They tend to export more. They tend to do more research and development. And they tend to pay more. So yes, we absolutely would want to have a lot of small companies. We would want to create them, but why wouldn't we want to continue them to grow? Part of it's just an attitude thing, and part of it's a risk aversion perhaps we have in Canada relative to other countries. It's a societal perspective. In the United States, they probably go too far, but you're not done by if you fail one time in the business world. You probably will get 10 credit cards sent to you the next day in the mail, or in Canada, you kind of make one slip and you're done. So there's some broader elements of that. But I think if we're going to succeed, particularly if we're going to succeed in the transition away from a carbon intensive economy, we need more firms that will continue to grow through that range. And it is created too. If you look at it, we always get this phenomenon in venture capital that it's not available. And it's always interesting because I have tried to probe both sides. Because firms that are looking for capital say they can never get it, but then those who have it and looking to invest it always say they don't have reasonable sources to invest it. But it seems to be generally available. Certainly if you have a new and interesting technology, tends to be available for larger firms, but again, the weakness tends to be in that smaller, around the $500,000 range, where it's harder to become available. So we've got that problem, and as Jack says, that has been so a lot of the recommendations of these various commissions we've had, but not much has changed. And certainly, we still get that cluster of firms stalling out and selling in that small to medium-sized range.
Yeah. So I'm just looking at the clock. We have another 6 minutes. Maybe we have time for a couple more traditional quick questions. Maybe they're not that quick, but for example, can you comment, both of you, on what you think the issues are around long-term low interest rates? Is that something to get worried about? People were very worried when some European countries actually had some negative interest rates, and I think that some of the fears have not really have not really appeared. But having said that, low interest rates is an issue. That's a question, actually.
That starts back to where I started with. I don't think it's healthy to now be 13 years into super lower interest rates. I do think it cuts the ability to create pools for investment over time. I think it is creating, well, we look at all sectors, the household sector, the business sector, and government sectors are beyond their eyeballs into debt, and I think that's creating a lot of liabilities. I think as it's now crossing into another generation, it's creating a mindset problem. I mean, looking at our age and guessing at the age of perhaps people that are listening, try telling a younger person that if they get a hold of $1, they should pay down their principal on their mortgage, and they'll look like you walked off from some other kind of planet. And you've got to understand why they're saying that. They've got perhaps even a mortgage less than 2%. And there's not a lot of juice for them. And of course, in our generation, faced with 17%, sometimes higher mortgages, was an easier thing to understand. But they're going to get caught out, and the economies get caught out by that kind of, and it will seem benign until it isn't. And so I think that's dangerous. And monetary policy should be the easiest job in the world. You just put your settings at neutral and just go home. And it wasn't intended to be interacting and influencing the economy in such a pervasive way for such a very long period of time. And I think problems come out of it. I will say, and a final disclosure, I am very fortunate to be one of the people in Canada in net saver position. 2 GICs expired in my account yesterday, and I renewed them at 0.5 and 0.7% rate of interest. So I'm peeved by the lower interest rate. So I had to add that there's a personal element. I don't like them as well.
Got it. Jack, do you want to say anything in addition to what Don just said?
Yeah, no, I just would add one point. Totally agree with what Don said. I mean, there's a psychology that's now being developed. It kind of reminds me of back in the 1960s. I think people forget that after the Second World War, we had repressed inflation, stimulus because we actually had rules that actually limited interest rates from going above, if I remember, 6% was a level.
6%.
Yeah, and what happened was, of course, mortgage rates were low and things like that, and so people, carried out their lives thinking interest rates would never go up, and then lo and behold, after 1970s shock and huge, actually, the federal government running primary deficits, meaning that their revenues were less than government spending for almost 12 years, if I recall, quite large numbers actually. That's when we got into all the debt problems, but also interest rates started going up a lot because of inflation, and that just changed the whole psychology. So now we've gone through this whole period of monetary contraction in the early 90s. It led to lower interest rates, lower inflation. People, I think, believe that 2% inflation is a likelihood. But we are going into a period with the past decade where interest rates have been lower, and the real interest rate has been lower than for a long time. And I suspect there will be a reversion back to a more normal number, and we may be seeing interest rates at higher levels, and then all of a sudden people's over exuberance is going to show up in some bad problems. And that happened, for example, in the late 1990s with all this investment that went into high-tech industries, companies that had no earnings. Kind of reminds me of something that's happening today. And And then all of a sudden, you know, there was a significant traction because people kind of figured out this was a wrong sort of thing that's happening. So I do have that fear that we're going to be facing problems within this decade that are going to be associated with the exuberance that we're taking on right now.
Well, thank you very much. I have a very quick question. I think it's a very big problem, but please, like a one-liner sort of answer would be great. Just looking at the clock, what do you think the best measure that the federal government can take to cool off the Canadian housing market? Just no need to explain, but what do you think? What is the one measure that the federal government can take to cool off the real estate market?
I would say federal government keep its nose out of it. To me, it's a supply issue. It's a provincial municipal problem.
Don?
Mine's not the federal government for that, but all kinds of other reasons. When the opportunity presents itself, and it's not necessarily here today, let's try to get monetary policy back to a more neutral setting and keep it there.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much. So with that last comment, we have come to the end of our webinar today. Once again, thank you very much, Don and Jack, for joining us today. Your insights have definitely improved our perspective on the significant challenges Canada is facing today economically, and what it will take to pay for our debt and to improve our growth and productivity, which are big issues. So to all the attendees, thank you very much for your participation today and your engagement, which contributed to a rich discussion. We thank you all for joining us at GRI this morning. We look forward to seeing you at other GRI events. Best wishes and stay safe.